Good morning, everyone. Son Excellent President Pedro Pires, merci, and all protocol observed. I would like to start in a very untraditional way. People don't start panels like this. But when I got the invitation to moderate the panel for the African Philanthropy Forum, I thought to myself, what is philanthropy all about and how does this relate to migration? So I did a quick Google search, as everyone does these days, and I said to myself, okay, let's look at what this says. So Google says, philanthropy is the desire to promote the welfare of others, its consciousness, its benevolence, and its humanitarianism. So this is what we're going to be talking about today when we talk about African youth and engage with migration. I would like to invite my fellow panelists up, my distinguished panelists, to come and join me. On the panel today, we have Ms. Ole Diba-Wada, who is the Director of Human Capital, Youth Skills and Development at the African Development Bank. She was previously the Executive Secretary for the Association for Development of Education in Africa. It goes on. She was the Executive Director for the Forum of African Women Educationists, the Executive Director for Femme Africa Solidarité, and held many other prestigious managerial roles, including roles at Oxfam, Concern Universal, and the Commonwealth Education Fund. Madame, welcome. Thank you. Please take a seat. Also joining us this morning is Mr. Carl Manlan, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the EcoBank Foundation, a project syndicate and an economist who has worked with NEPAD and the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria and improve public health financing on the continent. So these are the distinguished voices who will be debunking this topic with us this morning. So, in the next 80 years, Africa's youth is expected to grow by 181.4%. And this is in relation to Europe, which is going to shrink by 21.4%, and Asia, which will also shrink by 27.7%. And with migration flows, so rightly put and contextualized this morning within the continent, and 30 million young youth, African youth expected to enter the labor force every year by 2030. It's clear that we need to turn the jobless critical youth demographic into an economic powerhouse for the continent, and this involves capitalizing human potential on the continent. And how do we capitalize human potential? The one way that we can do this is creating jobs, which has been said by Madame Cynthia earlier on. But how do we create jobs if we don't have the skills? So how do we ensure broader access to education on the continent? The 2018 Index for Africa, Mo Ibrahim Index for African Governance report, notes that 60% of the 1.2 billion people of Africa are under the age of 25, and this is set to grow by 8.7% in the next 5 years. Shocking. Yet, 27 out of 54 of these countries have recorded a decrease or a deterioration in education, and this is driven by a mismatch between what is expected by the citizens and what is expected by those that are ready to absorb the citizens, so the job market and market needs. So how are we bridging a skills gap at tertiary or vocational level skills when half of those who qualify for lower secondary education in sub-Saharan Africa are not even enrolled, and only 1% of youth aged 15 to 24 on the continent are engaged in vocational skills? We just heard from the International Labour Organization that 90% of employment is in the informal sector. So I'm going to ask Ms. Ole to my left, what has the African Development Bank observed as challenges and opportunities for African youth on the continent?
Thank you very, very much. Mandy. Mandy.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mandy. Your Excellency, Mr. President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and my sister Cynthia, good morning. I think there was something that we realized in the African Development Bank, and that was that we needed to start focusing on entrepreneurial skills. That was a fundamental area. We also needed to, to shift this mindset of jobs where in the offices where people hold briefcases and have a suit and tie. And we also realized that there wasn't much investment in technical and vocational skills by governments because it is expensive. We also realized that there were so many partners on focusing on basic education and on lower secondary education. So we decided, okay, fine, we will focus on technical vocational skills, science, technology, and innovation, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics from the education component. And then from the jobs component, we will focus on entrepreneurship. And we developed a very ambitious strategy to create 25 million jobs over the next 10 years. And in doing so, we had to also take stock of what we felt were the priority needs of the African continent. And we identified 3 pillars. One was on agriculture, naturally, because we felt that the African continent would be the global food basket over the coming decades. And there was a need for us to look at how we can encourage more youth to go into agriculture, not for subsistence, but for economic reasons. We also realized that we needed to focus in the areas of industries. How do we help to build industries and get youths into those areas, especially when you're looking at agriculture and the entire value chain of agriculture. We also looked at the third area, which was on ICT, information, communication, and technology. And as Cynthia has said, it wasn't just about ICT per se, but looking at technologies and jobs for the future. And so under the agriculture component, we have an initiative called Enable Youth, where we're trying to get, and President Adesina talked about that yesterday, where we're trying to get youths to go into agriculture as agripreneurs. So not agriculture just to become a farmer and get a hoe and have, but more into agriculture for technology, for technological transformation. We also have an initiative that we are looking at under the information, communication, and technology, coding for employment, where we are trying to build capacities in certain countries to look at training, especially for young girls, coding on artificial intelligence, on drones, on blockchains, the whole works, but really trying to start looking at what will be the needs and jobs for the future. And then also on the industries. So there are components where we have been looking at creating within the African Development Bank zones, industrial zones in countries. And again, Cynthia had talked about, really going to the rural areas, to the grassroots areas, and creating industrial zones where we have agro-processing zones and connecting that with skills enhancement zones. And we thought that rather than have the youths leaving the rural areas and coming to the urban areas, that it was fundamental that we now take the industry to the rural areas where we link farmers in particular into these industrial zones and get the industry there, build the manufacturing plants there, and support in the entire agriculture value chain. So we really are trying to look at what we do, and in doing that, we've got different trust funds within the bank that we've created. The bank doesn't implement some of these things. We support governments, but we've also realized that in order to really reach out to the youths, we wanted to go directly through to them instead of going through governments and providing support. So in the different trust funds, one of the trust funds that I'll speak to is the multi-donor trust fund, where we have a pool that we've put together, invited donors to come together and see how they can put in funds to support on establishment of small, medium enterprises for youth, capacity building, mentorship, accompaniment, and so on. But in doing that also, we realized that we needed to make sure that we go through intermediaries as opposed to going directly to the government, or we can't, I mean, there's so many youths and youth organizations. So we thought if we build the capacity of these intermediaries, or they have that capacity, we will provide the grants to them and get them to provide the grants to the youths. We also realized that commercial banks do not provide startups for youths. Somebody has to take the risk, and the African Development Bank decided that as part of its creating of 25 million jobs, we will take that risk. We will provide the startups. We will target the missing middle, those who start, fail, start again. And we will build their capacity, because sometimes the needs vary. So not everyone wants money. Some just want mentorship, accompaniment, and capacity building. Others want startups. So we would look at those areas. But coming back to the migration issue, we decided that we will target countries that are migration hotspots first. So we targeted 5 countries where we are looking at supporting in this in these entrepreneurial skills and capacity building and helping on startups. We also decided we wanted to support in the areas of countries that are vulnerable to fundamentalist groups. And in doing so, we said, okay, we will focus on these countries first, which we identified for the first round, and then we can scale up. We have been working with ILO also to build capacity within the bank, because we also have to put our money where our mouth is. We can't be talking about this is what governments should do, this is what civil society should do, this is what... So we thought we needed to build capacity within the bank to see how we can get task managers, especially in the our major regional offices, on how we can measure jobs, how we can count jobs, and how we can also ensure the possibility of doing affirmative procurement. So if governments or countries request for finances from the bank, one of the requirements that we would put, or criteria that we would recommend, is the extent to which the number of youths at this particular age are part of, whether we're building a dam or a bridge or whatever, how many youths are in there, how many young women are in there. So these are some of the little areas or different areas that we are working, but we have a mixed bag of different components that we are working in the bank. We realize that, I mean, maybe Cynthia can correct me on the data. Every year there are about 12 million jobs that are required in the continent. And, government, or there are jobs that are being created for 3 million. So what is happening to this particular group in between? Who is doing what? And I think that's what we need to be looking at, who is doing what, and how can we, as she mentioned, formalize the informal sector. I think that's one of the key components that we should look at. Just wanted to speak on that. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think you've raised some really valid points. I would just like to probe a little bit and sort of ask about the challenges that you face, particularly in agriculture, because we've heard a lot of conversations about agriculture the whole weekend. And you spoke about a missing middle, but I'd like to probe you on a gendered missing middle. We speak about agriculture and we speak about bringing industry to the rural areas. From a gendered perspective, I look at this and say 70% of the arable land is tilled by women. But no one ever wants to talk about property rights. Have you seen challenges in that space as the bank engaging with these initiatives?
Yes, we have, and we realize that. And as a result of that, the bank decided to establish an affirmative financing for women in Africa, AFAWA. And I think this is, for the Jobs for Youth initiative, we've got about 40 million that we've just started. And this is, we were able to raise 40 million US dollars within 6-8 months, literally. And for AFAWA, we're also targeting, I think, about 70 million, so that we could, again, target it specifically for women. And we will also be working with the commercial banks, because we realize that the youths and the women are the ones that struggle the most to get access to finances. So we, again, are doing the same thing on the component for supporting women on financing in agriculture or in business in general. And also starting to work with commercial banks and naming and shaming the ones that couldn't and encouraging those who are opening up for women and providing access to finances and startups. But it is very, very difficult. We have a culture, but I think it's changing. I think there are countries that are now realizing. Tunisia is one of the first countries that is, has actually changed the inheritance. I mean, for majority, I think, I don't know what percentage they are, Muslims, and they've changed the inheritance law that is now looking at women getting, the equal rights of it. So I think it's changing, and if we get countries like that are making those changes, and women, naturally, they're the ones that pay the debts. They're the ones that are more reliable, and the bank realizes that. So the president of the bank really puts a lot of emphasis on what we do to support women in the countries, outside the countries, and bringing women's groups together and civil society in supporting them. So we realize this, but because the bank has a comparative advantage and a niche where it can actually engage in dialogue with countries, we decided that we needed to take the lead and also, encourage other DFIs and multilateral development organizations to engage in that. Thank you.
Carl, I'm going to ask you a question. So while the African Development Bank is gaining traction and moving forward and taking strides and bearing the risk, we still have this problem that we have to deal with. The World Bank notes that insufficient growth in Africa costs us 2.6% of per capita growth rate per year. And that is a ripple effect into human development, into skills development, limited skill development. So could I have a comment from you on that and what your views are on that?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Excellency. If we look in the streets of our countries, of our cities, or even rural areas, there are many skills that we don't even account for. So when there's somebody selling in the streets, they display skills in marketing, in negotiation, in sales that we don't even acknowledge. Do we actually think about how do we bring those skills into the classrooms and not necessarily thinking that they are uneducated and they are not actually providing an opportunity for others? So if we accept that education is not only what happens in the classrooms, but it is everywhere where it is possible, then maybe we'll start thinking differently about individuals that are actually entrepreneurs. When there's a football game, they'll sell you a jersey. When it's raining, they'll sell you an umbrella. It means that there's a supply chain in place that they understand that they are tapping into, but we never look into that area. I grew up in Abidjan, and there were women that walk on the door collecting empty bottles. Those empty bottles will find their way into other women that are making either juices or selling peanuts. We never help them to move from that informal way of collecting those empty bottles into connecting to a proper recycling system. So when we talk about the skills, we shouldn't look at only and account for those that have actually either tried to go to school, fell out of school, and stopped there. Because going to school is not necessarily the best way to acquire all the skills. But for those that are in the schools that are using either government resources or other resources, we have to make sure that they get the adequate skills. Now, when we look at the Africa we have, or the landscape that we have today, we understand that agriculture and ICT are the two areas that are very important for the skills that we need for the continent. Changing the education system to focus on just agriculture is going to be very difficult. But are we thinking about how do we get our farmers to actually train the younger generation? So you spoke of vocational training, but how many of the successful farmers that we have in our countries are actually taking the opportunity to train younger people? Are we giving them incentives to do so? Are there programs that actually recognize what we have as an opportunity to ensure that we tap into it? Because if we don't do it, and your introduction caught my attention because immediately we look at the comparison between Africa and Europe. We are 1.2 billion people, they are not. the challenges that we face on our continent are very different. Can we start looking at West Africa, Central Africa, and start having data on how we compare this one? Migration, for me, is an investment. I had the opportunity to leave my country about 21 years ago to go to Zimbabwe and South Africa to study. Others have done different paths, but it's always an investment. Yesterday, looking at the report, the individuals that are specialized now in smuggling make as much money as the European aid that is going to countries. So certain people have found a business out of it, unfortunately. But we have to recognize that if we're talking about the skills that we need and enhancing the opportunities for many more Africans to actually tap into the resources that we have already, we need to recognize that everybody's invited and not just count those that have actually attempted to go to school. On the question around migration, EcoBank has partnered with Terre des Hommes in Togo, and we have adapted our digital banking technology to allow children in the streets and migrant children to actually start saving on an account. We started in January, and regularly they come and deposit. There have been 2 withdrawals, one of them because there was a child that needed to fix his trousers, and the other one I can't remember. But the opportunity to use a platform that was not designed for migrant children or children in the streets, to allow them to start saving. And some of them have ambitions. They want to open a shop, they want to go back to school, and finding ways then for individuals in this room and everywhere with banking technology to be willing and able to actually invest in these young people.
I think that's absolutely amazing. And, funding pathways remain such a huge problem for young people on the continent, especially when we look at innovators. We know that we cannot provide formal jobs for the huge African, unemployment youth bulge on the continent. So how are we supporting the informal sector, those that are innovative outside the classroom? Are we building skill center, world-class skills centers on the continent so that people don't have to leave and then, think it's rosier on the other side of the Mediterranean and die on the other side, on the way there? What are we doing? So I think initiatives like this EcoBank initiative are absolutely brilliant, and we should be looking at replicating those and expanding those across the continent. So another question that came from the Next Generation Forum, because I'm reporting back as much as I'm a moderator, is why are we not investing in the innovators that we already have? Young Africans are innovating, they're entrepreneurial. But as my dear sister Natasha said yesterday on the high-level panel, they're only getting half of the way there because they don't have the funding to complete the journey. Why are we so suffocated on a continent that has growing philanthropists? The money is there, so why isn't the money being channeled into the right spaces? What are our priorities for funding? Would anyone like to take that?
I can speak to that. I think there's a need to be a shift in mindset. Not everyone is cut out for the classroom. And we also have to realize that, the grass is greener where you water it. The grass is not greener on the other side. And I think we need to start working with policymakers to look at certain areas. I think there's also an issue of communication, of us reaching out. Yesterday on our panel, albeit cut very short because President Ouattara was coming in, the lady from, I can't remember, I'm not sure whether it was from ITC or, and she said, yeah.
I see.
Yes, and she was saying that, and she was calling out names of investors, of young potential people, we are Africans, as Africans, we're storytellers. Why don't we are not framework analytical people, we're storytellers. And we have so many stories to tell. But if we don't share our narrative, somebody else's. And that's exactly what is happening with the migration. We're not talking about it, so those who are talking about it are actually telling the story from their perspective. When do we get up and actually come out and say the story as it is? It's not just for ILO to say it. We should be coming out and saying this. And I think there are quite a number of, a list of things that I feel that our governments need to do to rectify these areas. Skills. On TVET, there was a stigma attached to TVET. Anybody who went to TVET institutions were people who couldn't make it to high school. Technical, vocational education and training. And now we've realized that countries like Finland, like Switzerland, like, in Europe, they're prioritizing a TVET. So then we realize, we should come back to that. But, building on human capital is something that countries like South Korea grew up in. That's what, Singapore grew up in. They all prioritized on that. But we were all just focused on, and I keep saying it all the time, if my son 10 years ago said he wanted to go into agriculture, I'll have a heart attack. Probably would have. But today, I've come to realize that that's where, there's so much stereotyping in our culture. We're trying to cut and paste, square pegs into round holes. And I think we need to take stock of this and start looking at education for Africans, by Africans, that resonate with African education systems. We were taught differently, and for that reason, we have to hold a briefcase and go into the offices. We don't have skills. I think it is fundamental that every government should make sure that skills, both soft skills, entrepreneurial skills, and technical skills should be a requirement and necessity from early childhood. We should start ingraining that in the minds of our children, that it is, analytical skills and emotional skills. These are things that they don't teach in the classrooms. So how do we change this curriculum and this mindset and thinking? And I think there has to be a shift in mindset. And it starts from the top, but I think we all have a collective responsibility towards that. Thank you.
Absolutely, and Carl, I'm going to bring this back to you. So we all know that government budgets are strained, and they love listening to people with money. So how can the people with capital leverage governance to do what Ole has just said, to push narratives that put Africans first?
So we have this beautiful tendency of always looking up for answers. Maybe it comes from our prayers habit. But today, if I take numbers from the African Development Bank, there are 350 million Africans that have disposable income. They all have a cell phone and probably a smartphone. McKinsey report a couple of years ago told us that we will be spending about $1.4 trillion as expenditures. If we just use some of that money away from spending in things that we probably don't need, it will bring additional revenue. The other example is that if the 350 million Africans each spare $1 a month for 12 months, it's $4.2 billion. The largest foundation in the world today disburses about $4 billion a year. So it's not an issue of resources. We do it very well at funeral times, where we all come together and put the money in the kitty to make sure that the family, why can't we do it for things that matters? When the people are alive and we say that we don't have the resources. Governments have to deal with multiple elements. And I stay away from criticizing government because I never work in government, and they have multiple things that they have to deal with. But from a lateral perspective, are we starting to look at how communities organize themselves to make sure that we can invest in the community so that whatever happens in the community happens in the nation? So on the point around banks that do not lend money to startups, banks are regulated, and regulation requires them to protect the deposits of those that put the money in there. With the advantage of DFIs like the African Development Bank that are looking at creating opportunities for de-risking, it improves the conversation. But to just point the fingers and say that banks don't lend money, imagine if tomorrow you wake up and the bank has lent you money and the deposit that you had is no longer there. You will not ask the bank, why did they not try to help? Why did they help these young entrepreneurs?
In Zimbabwe, it's happened.
It happened, okay. So it is more looking at the options that we have today on the continent. Governments will do what they can, philanthropists will do what they can, but the taxation on the continent does not allow necessarily somebody who has means in country X to invest in country Y and claim some tax benefits. So you tend to see that funding from philanthropy will be focused on specific countries because so when we talk about philanthropies, we don't have a conversation on taxation.
Exactly. No, absolutely. But I'm going to bring it back and say there is something that governments can do that they haven't been doing, and it brings us back into the conversation around migration. The Open Free Trade Agreement is something that we've been lobbying governments to engage with and to sign up to and to take seriously. But it seems the biggest economies on the continent are reluctant. And you know, in talking about youth and migration, one skill that is saturated in one country could be, you know, a positive opportunity in another country. Why are governments not looking at the holistic picture and not only easing taxation in their own countries, but allowing transnational migration and mobility, social mobility? Would anyone like to come now?
So I am from Côte d'Ivoire. I worked in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Ghana, and I work in Togo. So clearly, this one is a difficult one for me to answer because they are example of migration. Most countries where you go to, you'll find probably a Senegalese that is selling something. We don't tell these stories. Isn't that the story of migration that we should be telling? When we now keep on talking about the few that risk their lives, building into a narrative of internal politics of other countries. I am not saying that their lives are not important, but I'm also saying that if we want young people to emulate those that have actually crossed from Senegal to Cape Town, from Senegal to DRC, we have to be telling these stories as well, and not just the story of those that have drowned in the sea. That is critical.
I think we also have to realize that government cannot do it all. We are all government. We all have a collective responsibility to make sure that we hold those who are in policy-making decisions accountable, but also hold ourselves responsible. I think we need to stop the blame gaming of government should do this, government should do that. You know, I think we all have civil society, community leaders, religious leaders, government. We all have a collective responsibility, individuals, because we are investing in our children, for those of us who can. And there are those of us who are also investing in other children. But I think, you know, for me, I have some pointers that I really wanted to focus on, that I think we need to make sure that we implement the Continental Free Trade Agreement. We need to allow the free movement of people. We need to ensure that private sector that encourage youths also have, you know, attractive tax incentives. We need to create that conducive environment, and we, and I mean all of us, in different ways where we know our powers are. We need to encourage commercial banks like EcoBank. You know, I have an EcoBank bank account, so I'll say that because they really are. You know, encourage more mentorship for youth. Youth need to see, you know, people and individuals who are successful and attach themselves, and we need to encourage that kind of relationship. As has been highlighted, we need to formalize the informal sector. Why are we attaching names, informal, formal, semi-formal, non-formal? You know, what is, you know, yeah, exactly. We need to reduce the bureaucratic red tapes, and that's where government really has a fundamental role to play. We need to sensitize the public entities on the importance of supporting and encouraging our youths. So there's a lot of things that we need to do, but I think maybe we need to do a mapping of who is best placed to do what and to encourage who does what and where and when. But the youths also have a responsibility, and we all need to work together, because at the end of the day, we are doing it for all of us, our children. And, you know, you never know what happens in life. We could be the ones crossing the Mediterranean tomorrow. So I think we need to be thinking about those things. Thank you.
So I think the message is clear. We definitely need to be telling our own stories. It's the stories we tell ourselves in our own countries, whether it's through the media, whether it's through perceptions we have of other people. It's what we tell our children and what they grow up listening to and learning about other African countries. We need to plan. We need to lobby governments to open up their borders, to reduce taxes. We need to get to a space where we're engaging with the culture of collective responsibility. And this is not just about philanthropists. We're all philanthropists in our own ways and in our small ways. So right now I'd like to open up the floor for a question and answer session for about 15 minutes. I think I'll take 2 questions at a time. Could we have the rolling mic right in the front?
Yes, good morning. Maybe to talk about our story is important, and tell you maybe how Cape Verde passed from immigration country to today immigration country. Okay, I have a lot of experience in the government. I passed 20 years of my life in the government since during independence. And what I can say, 2 things very important, because to make it short, because if I have to talk to Cape Verde, it will take time. First decision we took at the independence at 75. And one of key person of this was the President Pires. At this time, he was Prime Minister. We have to choose and invest in university, because in an independent country you have to have a university, or to invest in basic education. We decide at this time, with leadership of President Pires, to take priority for us in education, basic education, and we start invest in education. Today, 45 years after the independence, all Cape Verdean have a major 8 years of level. So this changed everything, because our people understand much more democracy, all these things we are taking, they understand this. So invest in education, basic education is key. We as an immigration country make our immigrants feel that they're part of a nation. And we develop the idea of global nation. You are Cape Verdean, even you are in South Africa or you are in the US, you are part of a global nation, this small country in the ocean, but you are part of this. And we try to teach them how to become a good citizen in the country where they are. Why? Because if they are a good citizen of France, doing what they have to do, they create an image, a credibility of the country, and people respect you. And we try to, and today, all our association of immigration outside are people who, they are well considered where they are. So I think it is important to develop this idea, maybe of, can say, African patriotism, that we belong to this continent, and we have to be good citizens of the world. This is very important for us to oblige people to respect. Respect is important for us. Africa needs respect. They talk about corruption in Africa. But you can obtain everything for an African if you give him respect. Because maybe because of the slavery. I don't know. We as Africans, we have a lot of problem of lack of respect from the other to us. We, Cape Verdean, we are a part of, we come from the slavery, so we know what is this respect.
Thank you so much. Wise words of wisdom there coming from Cape Verde. Could I have the gentleman to the left? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Worms, and I work for a Nairobi-based agricultural research organization. In the last growing season, the FAO has measured a deficit in global grain production of 30 million tons. It is expecting a deficit of global grain production of 40 million tons in the coming growing season because of the disaster in the American Midwest, in Australia, and in Southern Africa. Climate change is beginning to hit now, and food prices are beginning to rise. Now, we do agricultural research across Africa, and what we notice everywhere is that the fundamental problems that are facing African farmers are threefold. First, deep ignorance of how to avoid land degradation. You see people working extremely hard to destroy their soils and not get a yield. This has to change, and this goes through education. Second, a complete mismatch between what extension officers are doing and what farmers need. Extension officers have gone to university, they have theory. Their theory usually comes from textbooks that are written in the temperate zone, which has rich soils and year-round rains, and are completely inapplicable to the landscapes in which they live. They will know everything about growing maize in the Midwest and nothing at all about growing Hanza in Niger. Third, farmers are at the bottom of the social heap. Let's not kid ourselves. The reason why young people don't want to go into farming is not because there is no air-conditioned office attached to it. The reason why young people don't want to go into farming is because everybody will look down upon them. And to change that, we have to change the financial dynamics. Right now, farmers are working very, very hard to grow small amounts using bad techniques of basic commodities that have no value whatsoever beyond bare survival. Millet, maize, wheat, these things are not worth money. The things that are worth money are shea, they are mango, they are things that demand processing and that markets need. Processing is impossible because of issues that many of you have already discussed. The red tape, the poor infrastructure, the fact that every institution will want its pound of flesh to give you a meaningless piece of paper that you need to import a set of cardboard boxes simply to package your products. So unless these three things are fixed, one, get agroecological knowledge into the heads of the farmers, which means into the schools. Two, get farmers the advice that they need so that they can transform their own landscapes. And three, give agro-entrepreneurs in rural landscapes the ability to get the human resources, the financial resources, the machinery, and the infrastructure that they need to start transforming these products. We are not going to solve this problem, and hunger is going to spread. This is the most important thing. And what worries me deeply is that for the last 2 days, I have heard the words ICT, app, artificial intelligence, drones, mentioned 1 million times, but the word ecosystem mentioned precisely 0 times. And that is what is going to kill us all in the end if we don't pay attention.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Rashid Ambele Adebayo. Yeah, telling our story the way it is. Most of the time we talk about people moving out of the country. Now, but there's a salient point we are not been discussing, and that is what we call overpopulation. But the narrative of overpopulation, I don't see it as overpopulation. Rather, I see it as overconcentration. Lagos, for example, in Nigeria, as of 2006, was bid at a little over 9 million, and currently it is 21 million. It is not just only people living in Lagos that are giving birth that have that greater number, but why? People moving from the rural area to come down to Lagos. Now, as a policymaker, just like the first speaker said, and the president, why there isn't a collaboration whereby the factories that are being concentrated in Lagos can be moved to rural area? I'm talking of the factory. I'm not talking of the finished product. These factories can be situated in rural area. They will create direct job and indirect job rather than being in Lagos. There's a lot of places we're supposed to be residential area. It has been taken all over by these factories that can be in rural area. And it is very easy for them to transport their product back to Lagos or anywhere they want to go. But every one of them are concentrating in Lagos. And I believe that is how it is everywhere. Even right here in Cote d'Ivoire, majority of people call me, they concentrate in Abidjan. Because the factories, everything is in Abidjan. You don't hear about Yamsokoro, Dalua, or whatever. People are concentrating here. And at the end of the day, when it is overpopulated, people can afford to stay. Lagos, for example, not just anybody can just stay in Lagos. Why? Because of the overpopulation. Meanwhile, there is land, arable land, virtually everything that factory can make use of in the rural area. But because they are not there, everybody wants to come here.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Now, let me conclude with this. Now, if we talk about migration as well, we keep on talking about technology, but we have forgotten that even this agricultural, we can technicalize it in a way that can be more easier for the young people to want to go into it.
Thank you very much. Could I get a question specifically for the panelists? Yes.
Hello, my name is Ahmed K. Kone. I'm from Liberia. I'm a tech and edu entrepreneur. Madam Wada, you talked about how there are programs now that you get set together to help entrepreneurs and young people, be it through training and capacity development to help their communities. I would like to know how can we access some of the trainings that you have and how can we benefit from it? Because over the years, I have found it very easier to have an organization like Omedia, for instance, or Victor Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates. Those sort of foundations coming to help the African youth entrepreneur to more than, say, the African Development Bank and, other international African organizations that, you find on the continent. So how can we access some of the trainings that you have?
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question and then we'll, right at the front here, there's a lady in the front. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Good morning. So my name is Rasha Hafar and I'm from Tunisia and I work on human trafficking. And I would like to bring the topic here because I noticed during the whole weekend that human trafficking was not talked about. And it's actually a very dark side to migration and youth. So all these unemployed youth are actually going for jobs that are basically, a lot of them are fake, and then they end up trafficked and exploited. My question to you is, how can we actually see more philanthropists investing in anti-human trafficking efforts across Africa? We can see that all the money that comes to human trafficking efforts are coming from abroad, from the West, but in Africa the topic is very, very widespread. The crime is very big. A lot of youth are being trafficked, either migrating or in their own countries, and there's not really enough work done on the topic. So I would love to know your opinion about that. Thank you.
Yes, I'll just allow the panelists to answer the questions posed to them, and we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll have to wrap.
Thank you very much. For the gentleman who was talking about giving the Lagos example, that's exactly what we're trying to do in the African Development Bank. Create industrialized zones where we take the industry, the factories, to the rural areas, where if you are a youth and you're planting mangoes, and we've got 10 youths planting mangoes, we bring them together, we zone them, where all the mango growers are there, we have a factory there, you do the whole processing, you do the whole packaging, you do everything from there, and then we provide opportunities for access to markets to the urban areas. So we are trying to take the industry to the rural areas to avoid rural or urban migration. That's the first one. The second one, whether we like it or not, on technology, it's here to stay. Now, we either jump in that ship or the ship sails and we will sit here. But just to give you an example, mobile phones are the largest users of mobile phones is in Africa. So we want to say it, we don't want to talk about technologies, we don't want to talk about drones, that's fine. but it is here to stay. So we can decide to say what is our priority, which is agriculture. And I honestly believe agriculture is a priority. But if I look at a lot of the youths, whenever I go home and I'm coming and people know I'm coming, the first thing they will tell me is, I want a mobile phone. I want a laptop. So there's a generation that is looking towards a certain thing. Are we looking at their needs, or are we saying, no, it has to be agriculture? So I think we need to be very flexible. But technology is here to stay, whether it's a priority for us or not. What we are trying to do in the agriculture sector is technologies for Africa's transformation. And rather than you standing there and, you know, our farmers, the older farmers used to know when it would rain, they could smell the soil. You know, the young farmers don't have that know-how. So we want to use technologies to understand what the soil looks like, how does it feel, what's the texture, irrigation, climate, how to plant seeds. So we're trying to link technologies with agriculture. And I think it's a start. I think we spend too much time beating ourselves up with negative. So the more we talk about the negatives, the more negatives we have. There is so much positive things that are happening in the African continent. Why don't we say it? Why? Why are we always looking at this glass half full? Why don't we look at the glass half empty? Maybe that would help us to, you know, to progress. And then that would encourage us to tell our stories. So I think there is a lot that we know, but because we are not, somebody else is telling his story on us. On the Gates Foundation, I think somebody talked about, you know, others providing finances. The African Development Bank is not a foundation. The African Development Bank is a development bank. It is not a commercial bank. It doesn't give loans to individuals. So I think we need to really appreciate what the mandate of the African Development Bank is. However, we've come to realize that if we also do not shift our way of doing things and thinking, nobody else is going to do it. And we know we have a comparative advantage to that. And that's why we've set up all these trust funds and incentives where we can provide opportunities for youth, for women, and other initiatives that are different from what the bank is usually known for, to build bridges and dams and generators and whatever it is for governments. So there's a huge shift that is going on, and there's a lot of work that we are working with our partners. But if you really, really want to find out how you can get the financing, Ilyas is sitting there. And if you don't get the financing, it's because of him. So you can reach out to him.
There we go. There's the money guy. Carl, please, can I have your way?
Just quick, two points. The point around the ecosystem, I think, is critical, and I agree. EcoBank is building probably one of an interesting platform for anybody that can plug into it, can actually transact. So it will become the bedrock of the platform strategy that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is being put in place. Today, from where I sit, I can send money immediately in 33 countries using the EcoBank app. So a trader can go on to Messenger, use Rafiki, and create a bot that allows him to actually transact. So we are doing this work because we do believe that the financial transaction system must allow an ecosystem, being in agriculture and other areas, to actually thrive. On the human trafficking, I don't have enough knowledge to be able to comment on it, so I cannot. Yeah.
I'll take one more question. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. One more question.
Hi, my name is Kodo. I'm from Rwanda. I wanted to ask Ole from AFDB if one of the fears in Africa is also the political instability. So I'm just thinking of a young migrant, okay, who made it somewhere there and is working hard, sending money, investing home, and trying to prepare for his retirement. And he's from Zimbabwe, but then Mugabe goes and things go sour, and he can't get his money that he's been saving in the bank. You know, like, that's just so discouraging. And soon he's going to turn 55 and 60, and he's hoping to come back and retire at home. Is there a way the ADB can create some form of social, I don't know, maybe it exists, social security, trust, something where people can put their money, plan for retirement, and they are safe from whatever the president moves or things go. If Zimbabwe thinks I can go to Zambia and still collect my, something like that. I mean, now the only way to sort of plan and save and invest is to buy a house, buy land. We do know that our banking system is not safe. We have histories of our fathers where one day they went to the bank and there was no money, yet they had put money. So can FDB help to sort of create that social security system? And the other question was, how do we formalize? You did say we need to formalize. How do we formalize the informal jobs? I hate the word informal. And I know there is resistance from the business people to formalize, but how do we do it?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure. I know we have something about the pension funds and bonds in the African Development Bank. Maybe Nana, you can, I don't know. But I know we have some initiatives that are relating to social protection and social safety nets. I'm not sure how that works, but I also have to realize that, I think one of the problems is also, and maybe it is true, we attach too much to the name of the individual in the country as opposed to focusing on the systems. What we need is not about Mugabe coming and going. Mugabe will come and go, but Zimbabwe is there to stay. So I think what we need to do is to make sure that have those systems in place. And I think in terms of formalizing the informal sector, I think these are some of the policy mechanisms that we need to make sure that governments, ministries of education, ministries of labor, and private sector need to sit down. So there has to be a public-private discussion on how do we formalize the informal sector, because the majority of the workers are in the informal sector. But it has to be a dialogue and a mechanism. And I keep saying Africa is not one country. Africa is 54 countries. And the modalities, the modus operandi in every country would vary. So we cannot have a one-size-fits-all. We need to contextualize and see what will work in each of these countries. But I do agree that, like you, a lot of us struggle with the, social security issues. And some of us that are lucky work in organizations that provide that. But notwithstanding, I mean, those who can afford it, look for private pensions schemes that exist as opposed to, government pension schemes, because the money is not there to give it back to us when we turn 60. So I don't have an answer for that, but I think the bank is looking into that. But the bank works through governments on a lot of these things, and it is for us to provide those advice, capacity building, and guidance to countries to do that, but not for us as an institution to set up those kind of mechanisms. I hope that helps, but we can discuss offline later on. Thank you. And also on the human trafficking, this is not something that the bank is doing, but I do agree that it is becoming more and more. And but maybe again, this is something that we can discuss on what is possible, given that there is an increase in human trafficking coming up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So some valuable lessons and takeaways coming from this panel. I sure learned a lot from the two distinguished people sitting next to me. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out, and thank you to the African Philanthropy Forum for giving us the space to discuss these issues. So we need to be looking at closing the cycle of production on the continent. We need to retain our youth by looking and incentivizing them to take on agriculture and ICT as the industries of the future. We need to be paying attention to social protections and generational impacts of that. So thank you very much.